And thank you, Mrs. Capurro. And welcome, everyone here, to a beautiful and happy Sabbath day. And I'm wishing that also to the people on Zoom who are still watching us. And let's get into it. Have you ever looked back at your life and seen times that, as we say, were rough patches in our lives? Times that were hard on you. Sometimes you just didn't understand why life was so hard. And when times were hard, you may have thought to yourself, what did I do that was so wrong? Or you may say, why is my life so bad? Well, yes, most of the time it is because of our actions and when we go against God's way of life. But there are times when things happen to us that we end up in those rough patches, and it's meant to teach us a lesson, those times, the rough times. You see, there's a difference between effects of our intentions and God's intentions. The title for today's sermonette is God's Intent is Always for the Good. Now, this sermon is based on mainly readings that I've read about Joseph, the son of Jacob, who became Israel. But reading this story, I look back on my life, and I see things that have gone wrong in my life, but afterwards, when it's all said and done, things actually worked out so much better for me. Better than I could have ever imagined, especially when I was in those rough patches. And I know that most everyone sitting here can look back on their lives and see the same situation. So let's look at a few examples of Joseph's life. If we turn in our Bibles to Genesis 37, and we'll just read 3 and 4, verses 3 and 4. So Genesis 37, 3 and 4. And Israel loved Joseph more than all his sons because he was the son of his old age, and he made him a tunic reaching to the soles of his feet. And when his brothers saw that their father loved him more than his brothers, they hated him and could not speak peaceably to him. So we see that Jacob loved Joseph, and he meant well when he made him his tunic. But you see that his brothers saw that Jacob favored Joseph more than all of them, and they hated him for that. They hated him so much that they were going to kill him when Joseph followed them to Dothan. It was a city that they were going to with the sheep, and the brothers all had conspired together, and they wanted to kill him. And that's, you can read that in verse 17 of Genesis 37. But as you read further on, you see that instead they sold him into slavery. And if you go down to verses 27 and 28 of 37, Genesis 37, come, let us sell him to the Ishmaelites, and let not our hand be upon him, for he is our brother and our flesh. And his brothers hearkened. Then Midianite traders passed by, and they drew up Joseph and took him out of the pit and sold Joseph to the Ishmaelites for 20 pieces of silver, and they brought Joseph into Egypt. But as we read this, we know that God meant well for Joseph. Now, I'm guessing that Joseph was not very happy about the situation he was in. He may have been saying, what did I do to deserve this? You saw in the first point the differences between the effects of our intentions and of God's intentions. Well, in point 2, you see that when you have a relationship with God, and if you put your trust in him, he will use these times to work everything out for the good. Joseph was sold and went to Egypt, and you don't read of him complaining about it, because you see that he was bought by Potiphar, and in verse 2 of chapter 39, we read, "And the Lord was with Joseph, and he became a successful man, and he was in the house of his master the Egyptian." So we see that Joseph had a good relationship with God, and God turned something bad into something very good. Joseph had this relationship, and he trusted God. He had to, because you'll see by reading about Joseph, these things happened over and over to him in his life. The bad things happened, and in his case, not due to something he actually did, but after the bad, God makes his life that much better. So, and you can see when he was lived in Potiphar's house, his wife tried to get him to have relationships with him, and he ran. So he was doing what's right, and he ran out. But she claimed that he was trying to take advantage of her, so he was thrown in jail. So he was back down. But in jail, the jailer showed favor to him, and he became great in the jail. And then that led him going to being and meeting the Pharaoh and interpreting the dream, and made him the leader that he became. So now, in point 3, we see that God will use different circumstances to help train us to enhance our relationship with God. Now, if we go into chapter 50 now, Genesis chapter 50, and we start to read, we'll read verses 15 through 22. "And when Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, 'Joseph will perhaps hate us, and he will certainly repay us the evil which we did to him.' And they sent a message to Joseph, saying, 'Your father commanded before he died, saying, Thus shall you say to Joseph, I beseech you now, forgive the trespasses of your brothers and their sin, for they did evil to you. And please now forgive the trespasses of the servants of the God of your father.' And Joseph wept when they spoke to him. And his brothers also went and fell down before his face and said, 'Behold, we are your servant.' And Joseph said to them, 'Do not fear, for am I in the place of God? But as for you, you thought evil against me, but God meant it for good to bring it to pass, as it is this day, to save a great many people alive. And now do not fear, I will nourish you and your little ones.' And he comforted them and spoke to their hearts. And Joseph lived in Egypt, he and his father's house, and Joseph lived 110 years. So we read and see that Joseph learned to love. He wept over his brothers instead of bragging to them in verse 17. Joseph learned to forgive his brothers. In verse 19, he told them not to fear. And in verse 20, this is the verse that I feel sums up Joseph's life. It's the lesson that he had learned over and over. It states, 'But as for you, you thought evil against me, but God meant it for good to bring it to pass, as it is this day, to save a great many people alive.' Joseph knew that God had a plan, and Joseph understood that the bad times were all part of the training he had to go through in order to be the man God wanted him to be. Joseph also learned that the bad times in his life were used by God to bring to light the ultimate goodness of God. God's intent is always for the good. So going back over the points, 1, the difference between our intentions and God's intentions. 2, we must have a relationship with God and trust him to work everything out for the good. And 3, God uses these circumstances to train us to rule. So God took him, Joseph, out of the pit and placed him next to the throne of Pharaoh. But the training he went through his whole life made it fit for him to rule. Have a happy Sabbath.